Only 6 people in that room ever spoke about what happened. The others, they stayed silent, not from shame, not from fear, from something harder to name. Because some things, once witnessed, don't fit inside ordinary words. They live in the body. They replay behind closed eyes at 3 in the morning when the world is quiet and you're alone with what you saw. This is the story of one night, one room, one man who walked in believing he was untouchable and walked out understanding for the first time in his life what it feels like to be completely, utterly invisible. This is the night Viktor Kozlov met Bruce Lee, and nobody warned him. Let's go back. Hong Kong, 1972. The city never really slept, not in those years. It hummed and crackled with energy. Neon signs bleeding color into the wet streets, the smell of salt air mixing with roasted sesame and diesel. The film industry was exploding. Bruce Lee had just finished Fist of Fury. His name was spreading like fire across Asia, crossing oceans, reaching into living rooms and gyms and street corners in ways that no Chinese actor, no Chinese man had ever reached before. But fame has a shadow, and in that shadow lived men who wanted to test it. Viktor Kozlov was not a random man. That's important to understand. He wasn't a drunk looking for trouble in the wrong bar. He wasn't an insecure amateur with something to prove. Viktor Kozlov was a serious man. Originally from Vladivostok, he had relocated to Hong Kong 3 years earlier through connections in the shipping industry, connections that were best not examined too closely. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, 230 pounds, not soft weight. He had trained in Sambo from the age of 9, had competed across the Soviet Union in his 20s, and had never, not once, been knocked off his feet in a sanctioned match. He had also never lost a private fight. And in Hong Kong in 1972, if you moved in certain circles, private fights happened, quietly, in back rooms, in warehouses by the water, organized by men who wore suits and didn't smile, attended by other men who brought cash and said nothing to no one afterward. Viktor had won 11 of these. 11. Some lasted minutes, most lasted seconds. One, and people still whispered about this, lasted less than 4 seconds total, from the opening stance to the opponent on the ground, unable to stand. Viktor Kozlov was not a joke. But Viktor Kozlov had an ego the size of the South China Sea. It wasn't loud, that was the thing about him. He wasn't one of those men who screamed and beat his chest and demanded attention. His arrogance was quieter, more dangerous. It lived in the way he looked at people, or more accurately, the way he looked through them, like furniture, like their presence was technically noted but ultimately irrelevant to his existence. He had heard of Bruce Lee. Of course he had. Everyone had. He had watched clips, he had asked questions, he had done his research the way a professional does research, dispassionately, clinically, without emotion clouding the analysis. And his conclusion? A performer, he told his associate Wei Ming one evening, sitting at a restaurant on the harbor, picking at steamed fish with his chopsticks. He set down his chopsticks, shook his head slowly. A performer. He weighs 60 kilograms, maybe less. I have beaten men who ate men like him for breakfast. Wei Ming said nothing. Wei Ming had seen Bruce Lee train once through a window at a private gym in Kowloon. Wei Ming said nothing. The meeting was arranged through layers of intermediaries, the way these things always were. A mutual acquaintance, a location decided at the last moment, no cameras, no documentation, an understanding spoken in vague terms, denied in vaguer ones, that this was a private demonstration, a test of skill between 2 martial artists, friendly in the loosest possible sense of the word. Bruce Lee agreed. This is the part that always raises questions. Why did he agree? He was a film star by then. He had everything to lose and nothing obvious to gain. He didn't need to prove himself to Viktor Kozlov or anyone like him. But people who knew Bruce Lee, truly knew him, understood something. He didn't agree out of arrogance. He agreed because he believed with his entire being that martial arts was not a performance, it was not choreography, it was not illusion dressed up in beautiful movement for an appreciative audience. It was truth. And when someone questioned that truth, even privately, even in a restaurant over steamed fish, Bruce Lee felt it, the way you feel a splinter you can't quite see, small, persistent, impossible to ignore. He agreed because he had to, not for the crowd, not for the legend, for himself.
The location was a warehouse in the Kwantong district. Industrial, functional, the kind of building that exists in every port city in the world. Concrete walls, corrugated metal roof, the smell of motor oil and old wood baked into every surface. Strip lighting overhead, harsh and white, casting everything in that particular fluorescent clarity that makes faces look skeletal and shadows look permanent. 12 people total in that room. Victor brought 4 men with him. 2 were associates, 2 were there for reasons nobody asked about. He arrived first, walked the space with his hands clasped behind his back, took his time, said nothing. He wore a gray athletic shirt, loose training trousers. He moved like a man who owned whatever room he entered. Bruce Lee arrived 20 minutes later with 2 people, his friend and colleague, and a man named Hawkins Chung, who had trained with him years earlier and remained one of the few people in the world who had sparred with Bruce Lee enough times to have a genuine, unfiltered understanding of what he was capable of. Lee walked in wearing a simple black training outfit. He was, as Victor had noted in his research, small. 135 pounds, 5 feet 7. Victor looked at him across the warehouse floor, and something moved across his face, not contempt exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like a chess player who arrives expecting a grand master and finds a child sitting across the board. He had prepared for a serious fight. What stood before him looked like a moderately athletic young man. He relaxed. That was his first mistake. The second mistake happened in the moment before the fight began, when Victor turned to one of his associates and said something in Russian, quiet, brief. The associate smiled. Hawkins Chung, who had studied Russian in school and never mentioned it to anyone in that room, understood every word. He said nothing. He turned and looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was standing still in the center of the warehouse floor. He wasn't stretching. He wasn't shadowboxing. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing. Feet shoulder-width apart, arms loose at his sides, head slightly down, chin tucked, eyes up, watching Victor from beneath his brow line. Calm. Completely, unnervingly calm. Not the calm of indifference, not the calm of someone who doesn't understand the danger. The calm of a river 3 seconds before it breaks a dam. Victor's associate, still smiling from whatever had been said, stepped forward to explain the terms. Simple terms. No strikes to the head. This was a demonstration, not a death match. First man to lose balance or submit. No time limit. Victor nodded. Bruce Lee blinked once. The associate stepped back. The room went quiet. Not gradually, immediately, like a switch. 12 people breathing, and somehow even that felt too loud. Victor settled into his sambo stance, low center of gravity, weight balanced forward. His hands came up, not in a traditional boxing guard, something wider, something designed for grappling entries, for controlling distance, for closing the gap and using that 230-pound frame as a weapon the way it had been used 11 times before. He was good. Genuinely, technically, professionally good. Bruce Lee watched him, didn't move. Victor took a half step forward, testing, measuring distance, looking for the reaction. Would Lee back up? Would he shift his weight? Would he flinch? Lee didn't move. Victor adjusted. The half step became a full step. His hands opened slightly, preparing for a clinch entry, the move that had ended more fights than he could count. The sudden surge, the wrap, the weight differential doing the work that skill set up. He had done it 1,000 times. His body knew it the way a pianist's hands know a chord. He committed. The execution, the exchange. Here is what happened in the next 1.8 seconds. Victor surged forward. Lee didn't step back. He didn't step sideways. He stepped into the attack, into the space Victor had vacated by committing forward, the half-inch gap between intention and arrival, that microscopic corridor of time that most fighters never even perceive, let alone exploit. Lee walked through it like he had a key. His lead hand came up, not a punch, a deflection, palm out, redirecting Victor's incoming right arm across his own center line, turning Victor's own momentum and mass into a problem rather than a weapon. Simultaneously, and this is the part that nobody in that room could fully explain afterward when they tried to reconstruct it, simultaneously, Lee's rear hand drove forward. Not a full punch, a half punch, a piston strike, 1 inch of travel, the famous 1-inch concept that he had demonstrated on stages and in gyms, and that people had photographed and filmed, but that nobody who hadn't felt it truly understood. It connected just below Victor's sternum. 1 inch of travel, 230 pounds of Victor stopped moving forward. Just stopped, like a car hitting a wall at speed. Not a slow deceleration, an abrupt, physics-defying cessation. Victor's breath left his body, not from pain, not yet, but from pure, involuntary biomechanical shock. Every muscle in his torso fired at once in defensive response, and his body, all 6'2" and 230 pounds of trained, experienced, professional fighting machinery, curled forward at the waist. The whole exchange took 1.8 seconds. Victor was not on the ground. He was still standing, but he was no longer moving. He was standing in the center of that warehouse floor, bent slightly at the waist, one hand coming down toward his stomach, with an expression on his face that none of the 12 people in that room had ever seen on him before. Confusion. Pure, unfiltered confusion. He looked down at his own body like it had betrayed him, like it was someone else's body that had just malfunctioned, and he was simply an observer trying to understand what had gone wrong with the machinery. Bruce Lee had already stepped back. He was standing where he'd been standing before, feet shoulder-width apart, arms loose at his sides, head slightly down, chin tucked, eyes up, like nothing had happened. Like those 1.8 seconds were simply the natural continuation of standing still.
The room. Nobody spoke. One of Victor's associates, the one who had smiled at the Russian comment, was no longer smiling. He was staring. The other 11 people in that warehouse were doing the same thing, because what they had just watched defied the visual grammar of fighting that every single one of them had spent years accumulating. Fighting looked a certain way. It had a rhythm. It had visible effort. It had wind-up and follow-through and the satisfying mechanical logic of force meeting resistance. What they had just seen had none of that. It looked less like a fight and more like a question being answered. Victor asked, "Can you stop me?" And Lee responded. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with the screaming ki and the spinning kick and the explosive choreography that people associated with martial arts movies, with Bruce Lee movies, ironically. He responded the way electricity responds when you complete a circuit. Quietly, instantly, completely. Victor straightened up slowly. He breathed. Once, twice. His face went through several things in rapid succession. The confusion settled. Something darker moved in underneath it. Not anger exactly, something colder. The professional recalibration of a serious man who has just encountered data that does not match his model of the world. He looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee looked back at him. Neither man said a word. And in that silence, that 10-second silence that felt like it lasted considerably longer, something passed between them. Not aggression, not the performative alpha male dominance game that lesser men play in moments like this. Something else. Recognition. Victor Kozlov, for the first time in 11 professional private fights and a lifetime of training and competition, was looking at something he did not understand. and he was honest enough, serious enough in his cold, professional way to recognize that. He rolled his shoulders back, he reset his stance, and he came again.
The second approach. Viktor Kozlov was not a man who learned slowly. That was the thing about him, that cold, professional intelligence that had carried him through 11 fights, through years of sambo competition, through the kind of life that required constant, accurate assessment of danger. It worked fast. He had felt the strike. He understood, somewhere beneath the confusion and the bruised pride, what had happened mechanically, the deflection, the entry, the impossibly compressed power in that half-inch of travel. He had catalogued it the way a scientist catalogues an anomaly, not with emotion, but with attention. He wouldn't be caught the same way twice. He reset his stance. This time, lower, weight further back. His entry would be slower, more controlled, sacrifice the explosive speed of the surge for a more measured approach, use his reach advantage, keep distance until he could find the grip that would make everything else irrelevant. Because Viktor's truth, the bedrock assumption beneath every fight he had ever won, was this: once he had his hands on you, it was over. Size, leverage, groundwork, the inevitable physics of mass and control. Once he had his hands on you. He moved forward again, slower this time, deliberate, circling slightly left, drawing Lee's attention to the angle, setting up the entry from the opposite side. It was smart. Against any other opponent in that warehouse, against any other opponent Viktor had ever faced, it would have worked. Bruce Lee watched him circle. And here is what nobody in that room understood yet, what they were only beginning to feel in the back of their skulls like a distant frequency, something almost below hearing, was that Lee wasn't reacting to Viktor's movements. He was reading them. There is a concept in Wing Chun, the style Lee had trained under Ip Man before building his own philosophy, called Chi Sao, sticky hands, the practice of maintaining contact with an opponent's limbs to feel intention before it becomes action, to bypass the visual entirely and operate at the level of pure nervous system information. Lee had trained it for years. But what he had developed beyond Chi Sao, beyond any single style or technique, was something harder to name and impossible to teach in a classroom. He could feel the shape of a fight before it happened. Not psychically, not mystically. Through 10,000 hours of training that had rewired his nervous system at a fundamental level, he processed microsignals, weight distribution, shoulder tension, the angle of a knee bend, the dilation of focus in an opponent's eyes, faster than conscious thought. He didn't see Viktor coming. He already knew where Viktor was going. Viktor committed to his entry. Left feint, then drive right, the grip attempt, arms spreading wide to maximize the capture zone, using his wingspan to compensate for whatever deflection Lee might attempt. Lee moved. Not away, through. It was the only word for it afterward, when the witnesses tried to describe it. He moved through the attack like it wasn't there. Under Viktor's left arm, inside his reach, occupying the one geometric position from which Viktor's size and strength were completely mathematically useless. Too close for leverage, too inside for power, the dead zone that big men never expect a smaller opponent to choose willingly. 2 strikes, compact, vertical, delivered from 4 inches of distance with the mechanical efficiency of a machine that had been designed for exactly this specific purpose. Ribs, solar plexus. Not to injure, not with full force. Enough. Viktor's arms came down. Involuntarily, a reflex so deep it bypassed conscious instruction entirely, the body protecting itself, folding around the point of impact, because the body is honest, even when the mind insists on courage. He stepped back, 1 step, then another. His heel found the wall behind him. He stopped.
The silence that changed everything. 30 seconds had passed since Viktor Kaslov entered that warehouse believing this would be simple. He stood against the wall now, with his heels touching concrete and his hands at his stomach, and his breath coming in measured, controlled pulls. The controlled breathing of a trained athlete managing pain, managing shock, managing the seismic reconfiguration of everything he thought he knew. Bruce Lee stood in the center of the room. He hadn't broken a sweat. This is the detail that everyone who was there mentioned first when they eventually, years later, told someone who told someone else. Not the speed, not the precision, not the fact that a 135-pound man had just neutralized someone nearly 100 pounds heavier twice in under a minute. The sweat. He hadn't broken a sweat. He stood in that harsh fluorescent light with his black training clothes perfectly settled, breathing normally, his face carrying the same expression it had carried since he walked through the door. Not triumph, not contempt. Attention. He was still paying attention, still reading, still present in the fight in a way that suggested he could have continued for another hour without the calculation changing in any meaningful way. Victor looked at him. A long look, the kind of look that travels inward as much as outward. The look of a man taking genuine, unflinching inventory. Hawkins Chung, watching from the side of the room, would say years later that this was the moment. Not the strikes, not the deflections, this look. The moment Viktor Kaslov, a man who had never in his adult life encountered a physical force he couldn't eventually overcome, accepted something. Nobody spoke. One of Victor's associates shifted his weight. The floor creaked. Someone coughed once, and then seemed immediately embarrassed by the sound, by the way it broke the texture of the silence. Victor pushed off the wall. He walked to the center of the room. He stopped 6 feet from Bruce Lee. He looked at him for another long moment. Then he did something that nobody in that room expected. He bowed. Not a deep bow, not theatrical. A short, precise inclination of the head, the formal acknowledgement of one fighter to another that exists in every martial tradition in the world. The gesture that means, I see you, I recognize what you are. Bruce Lee returned it. Same depth, same precision. And that was the end of the fight. Aftermath. Nobody talked about it that night. They filed out of that warehouse in Kwun Tong in ones and twos, back into the Hong Kong night, into the neon and the harbor smell and the noise of the city that had continued its existence completely indifferent to what had just occurred in that concrete room. Victor's associates walked to their car without speaking. One of them, the one who had smiled at the Russian comment, whose smile had disappeared and never returned, stopped briefly on the pavement outside, lit a cigarette, stared at the sky for a moment, then got into the car. Victor himself sat in the back seat for a long time before saying anything. What he finally said was not in Russian. He said it in English, quietly, to no one in particular. I have never been touched like that. Not hit, not struck, touched. The word choice matters. It implies something different from violence, something more intimate, more complete, the sense of being reached by something that bypassed your defenses entirely, not through superior force, but through superior understanding. That word traveled, slowly, through whispered retellings in the right circles, it traveled. 3 of the 12 people in that room kept the story entirely to themselves for the rest of their lives. 2 others mentioned it only once each, decades apart, to people they trusted absolutely. One of Victor's associates eventually told the story in full, but only in his final years, to his son, who had asked him one evening, "What was the most important thing you ever saw?" He thought about it for a long time. Then he told him about the warehouse in Kwun Tong. The story never made the newspapers, it never made the documentary films or the tribute specials or the biography chapters. It lived only in the oral tradition, passed person to person, acquiring texture and detail with each retelling the way genuine legends do. But certain elements remained consistent across every version.
The warehouse, the silence, the 2 strikes, Victor's heels against the wall, and the sweat that was never there.
The ripple. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in Viktor Kozlov. His associates noticed it. It wasn't dramatic. He was not a dramatic man, but it was real. He began to ask different questions, not just about Lee specifically, but about the nature of what he had experienced, about the gap between his model of fighting, size, strength, trained technique, the reliable physics of mass, and what he had felt in that warehouse, the way Lee's body had moved through geometry that Victor's mind had classified as covered, defended, closed. He sought out a Sifu in Kowloon. Old man, 70-something, had trained under teachers who had trained under teachers going back to the Qing dynasty. Victor sat across from him in a tea room above a pharmacy and asked, in his blunt way, to understand what he had experienced. The old Sifu listened. He asked 3 questions. Then he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You were fighting a wall. He was fighting water." Victor looked at him. "When you push water," the Sifu continued, pouring more tea, "where does it go?" Victor didn't answer. "Everywhere," the Sifu said. "And when you try to grip it?" Victor understood. He didn't become a different fighter. He was too old, too formed, too deep in his own tradition for transformation. But he became a different thinker about fighting, and eventually, privately, a different thinker about a great many other things. He trained Sambo for another decade. He never entered another private fight. When asked why, on the one occasion someone asked directly, he smiled with the left side of his mouth only. "I found my ceiling," he said. "Most people never do."